Hi, everybody, and welcome to this presentation on Carnatic music for Gamaka. Before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered here today as we present this, I suppose, conversation that I'm having with a good friend. We'd like to pay our respects to the traditional custodians, past and present, and to all those who may be listening. On that note, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional practitioners of the hereditary communities who have been practicing the art forms that we today call Carnatic music, and acknowledge all the experiences that they have faced in allowing us to enjoy Carnatic music today. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Subangan Nirmaleswaran, who, apart from being a fellow musician based in Sydney, where both of us are at the moment, he's also a very good friend. And today we are talking about Rama and Carnatic music as we celebrate the occasion of Rama Navami, or the birth of Rama. And in this conversation, what we want to mainly focus on is a discussion on how Rama is framed and presented through Carnatic music, through the many Carnatic compositions, and the role that Lord Rama plays in this musical practice. I'd also like to just express some gratitude to the work of many musicologists and musicians that and scholars that have helped frame the conversations that we have today. Some of them include Sriram Iyer and violin vidwan R.K. Sriram Kumar, who are people who write and present lecture demonstrations on topics such as these, and many others. And I just appreciate the guidance that they give us, and it's just, I suppose it helps us frame our conversations, our thought processes, as we embark on this conversation today. So Rama, as we may or may not know, is considered to be an incarnation of the god Vishnu, and plays a huge role in the Hindu mythology that underpins a lot of Carnatic music. So Rama as the dominant character in the Ramayana, which is one of the great epics of literature in India, written by Valmiki hundreds, if not thousands of years ago, and of which there have been many translations and versions over the years. But perhaps because of the story of Rama, or is it because of the great virtues that Rama is supposed to represent? This is a figure that has been represented very widely in Carnatic music and Carnatic compositions. So what we thought we would do is to unpack how Rama plays that role in Carnatic music. So perhaps the first question I'd throw to Subangan is, how do you see Rama positioned in Carnatic music? And what role does this figure play?
Hello to everybody. Thank you, Arj, for that question. So, yes, I think Rama is he's become quite the central figure when it comes to Carnatic music. And I think there's a wide variety of reasons for that. I think the most obvious one is that, of course, Rama is the composer who is the Easter Devata of the composer Sri Saint Tyagaraja, and Tyagaraja Swami's compositions, the proliferation of his compositions that are in use today. And also the fact that he composed a wide variety or a wide range of kirtanams, which can be used in, I guess, different parts of the kacheri structure. So when you look at in those sorts of sense, the representation of Rama versus, say, other gods in Hinduism, which generally tend to be the topics covered in Carnatic compositions, you can find that there's definitely a lot more. There's a lot more of an emphasis or a focus on Kirtanams which feature him. And I think that he's the way that he has been positioned in Carnatic music as well, is that he's definitely a deity that is not to be. He's definitely a deity that we would say cannot be avoided, and in terms of like a lot of even if you look at how some of the aradhanas are working around the world, so they'll usually have a photo of Rama right next to Tyagaraja Swami, and they will worship Rama, and he's become very integral to the Carnatic music community by virtue of, I guess, the sheer number of compositions that have been sung in his praise. So I think he's definitely one of the most prominent figures, and I think very well connected to Carnatic music.
It's interesting, even if you take the name Rama, um, something that I did not know, but in looking in, preparing for our conversation today for Gamaka, I realized that Rama, or learned that Rama is actually considered to invoke the names of both Lord Shiva and Vishnu. The ancient sage Vasishtha, who is one of the sages in the Ramayana that asks Dasaratha to give his sons to help protect them in the forest. When Rama is born, Dasaratha asks Vasishtha to name Rama, well, before he's named Rama, but to name this eldest son. So it is said that Vasishtha bestowed the name Rama because he takes the syllable Ra from the Ashtakshara mantra of Vishnu, which is Om Namo Narayana, and the syllable Ma from the Shiva Panchakshari mantra, which is Namah Shivaya. And these are both syllables, the Ra and the Ma, to be what they call Jivaksharas, or syllables that give life to those particular mantras. And so in combining both of those syllables, you get the name of Rama. And so I think, I think there's many things, such as if you say the name of Rama even just 3 times, it's equal to saying the Shiva Panchakshari mantra or the Vishnu Sahasranamam 1,000 times. And it's considered to have such significance. And these are the kinds of things that I think are really interesting in Carnatic music, because such almost a small but significant part of that philosophy is captured in like a Tyagaraja composition, which I didn't really understand because I am Tamil speaking. But when I look at the Kriti Everani, which is in Devamrita Vashani Raga, Tyagaraja sings in the Charanam, Shiva mantra munaku, ma jivamu, madhava mantra munaku, rajivamu. So the idea is that he captures this in that kriti. And so I think that's what's so interesting. Like a lot of these ways of understanding or interpretation have been so well codified in just a really beautiful line of poetry that someone like Tyagaraja has composed. I think, anyway, I just thought that was a really interesting thing to share.
Yeah, 100%. And I think even, that second point that you made as well, there is another composition, Ni Balama, Ni Nama Balama, in Raga Ananda Bhairavi. But once again, he's saying, who is more powerful? Is it Rama, or is actually Rama's name itself is more powerful? So you can kind of start to see the thought processes of the composer, where they've sort of they're not just venerated Rama, but also all those things that kind of surround the myth, or the not so much a myth, but like the grandeur of the Lord, and sort of and each of these compositions, you'll find these lovely little nuggets, and it might just be a little throwaway line, but there's so much meaning behind that, and I think that's a very special aspect of Carnatic music, and so to discuss those aspects as well as part of this Rama Navami special, I think it's really important that we as listeners also try to understand that whilst we take a lot of these compositions and we use them as performance pieces, but particularly for a lot of the composers, they weren't just it wasn't created for performance. It was more of an outpouring of their bhakti and devotion to the Lord, and they saw the Lord in so many different ways and in facets, which I think is reflected in these compositions. And I think it's a great way for these compositions to be almost as like a bridge for us to kind of to learn from the past. From these great composers.
You say that. I think that probably in some ways answers part of the question that I raised earlier, that what is the role that Rama plays. I mean, one of the things that we almost an underlying assumption here is that this religiosity, the notion of devotion and bhakti, they underpin Carnatic music, and Carnatic music has, because of tradition over many years, been so intrinsically associated with Hindu mythology. And Rama sits at the center of that because of the Ramayana. And I think what's interesting, though, is probably asking us, why is it amongst the pantheon of many, many gods of Hindu mythology that Rama holds such significance in Carnatic music today? I mean, there's a question there as to why has Rama, been composed upon so much, but also why does the songs in praise of Rama play such an important or common? Why are they common on the Carnatic stage today? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think again, like with most discussions, Tyagaraja Swami will be the focal point of this. It's such that, I mean, if you read up a little bit on the history of Saint Tyagaraja, you will realize that he's the influence of Rama in his life was introduced to him by his mother. Who herself was a well-known practitioner of music at that point. And it is said that she taught him a lot of Bhadrachala Ramadasa compositions. And so a young Tyagaraja apparently used to scribble on his walls, and he used to compose, and and that's how like his journey started in terms of musically. And then it was to be that several people had spotted this, that had come to visit the parents, and then they said, okay, this person has got a lot of potential, and then they recommended more formal training for Tyagaraja Swami. So it is legend has it that Narada Swami is said to have presented a book, Soratnava, to Tyagaraja, and then so he's sort of that again that sort of ties into that the theological views of Narada Swami being, of course, a devotee of Vishnu, and then from there onwards we also know that he was influenced by Venkata Subbayar, and then so then the young Tyagaraja grows up, and obviously these influences then led to him composing extensively on Rama, and so I think the influence that Tyagaraja Swami has over Carnatic music is such that had the roles been reversed and we say that he composed exclusively on Devi, then perhaps he may be having a discussion around how come Devi Kirtanams are so prolific as well. So I mean, that's just one theory. The other thing as well to note is that Carnatic music compositions have not always been exclusively God-based per se. I think it is important for us to understand that in the history of Carnatic music and its evolution, we have seen that when it comes to the delivery or the mode of delivery of Carnatic music, which is now effectively, when we think of Carnatic music, we just immediately think of Sabha Sangeetam. That wasn't the only stream in which a listener can access Carnatic music. Now, beforehand, you had the rajas, the various courts, of the zamindars and also of royalty who of course we know for centuries and centuries have had a number of court musicians. Now, of course, the subject of those musicians and of those musical compositions presented in the courts were religious of nature, but at the same time, they also covered other aspects as well. I mean, we know, for instance, that there's a number of compositions that were just composed on the king, per se, by the court musicians. So that system has obviously collapsed. That's not there anymore. You don't really see the court system really existing. So therefore, notable exception is of course what's happening in Trivandrum, where the royal family is still keeping it, and there are some exceptions like that, but it's not that prolific anymore. Then you've had obviously the decline and collapse of the Devdasi system. And I think in the Devdasi system particularly, the sorts of compositions were not always bhakti focused, which is something that we're all starting to understand. So a lot of those compositions sadly were lost with that. And also then, while some of them did sort of make it through, a few of the Padams and Javalis have made it through to the concert platform. But even then, the ones that did make it through the concert platform were ones that had more of a bhakti focus rather than on a lot of the other ones that covered other topics, such as romance, and all of those ones did sort of end up getting not the same amount of prominence. So that other stream has also disappeared. And a third one, which is sadly disappearing, is the temple tradition. So that is, aside from the Devdasi system, which I think in itself deserves to be recognized as a separate entity altogether, the temple system. So what I mean by the temple system is I'm referring to the Tamil Nadaswara traditions. So in the Tamil Nadaswara traditions, the concept of the Mallaris. The Mallari is not just one piece. They have various varieties of different types of Mallaris. There is a Taliga Mallari, there is a Ter Mallari. So there's different types of Mallaris which were designed to be played at different times, and also then the Nadaswara Tamil tradition itself is indeed like a very advanced and well-developed tradition with so many specific compositions. But once again, we're starting to see a decline in the number of people attending temple kacheris and also the number of artists who are doing in terms of professionally playing and Nadaswaram and Tamil. So I think again we've lost that aspect, and also within that temple tradition as well, there is still a little bit of that little crossover between the Pandisai and the Carnatic music, which is that there are ragas which particularly have been around since the Pandisai tradition, and that they were still being performed, whereas nowadays, once again, that's also sadly been in the decline. So a lot of obviously the Theravadams were focused mainly on Shiva and the deities who are prominent in the Saiva tradition. So again, you've seen that sort of decline. So now we're kind of left with Carnatic music is effectively represented by one of the four traditional streams of music, which is the Sabha system. So I think that then what that means is that whatever focus that the Sabha system has got currently then becomes amplified, because now we've got a dilution in the number of channels available for people to access music. And then when you delve into the Sabha system, I think it's also important to recognize a couple of different things as well, which is that the focus of the Trinity in the concepts that are being presented in the Sabha system, musically obviously highly justified. I mean, I don't think that it's really a matter of discussion. It's not. So we all understand why there is a prominence placed on these composers, but at the same time, it just so happened that of the three Tanjavur Trinity, we've got roughly about 700 or 780 verified compositions of Tyagaraja Swami. And we know that in the Sangeeta Sampradaya Pradarshini, I think we've got 215 or so which are confirmed with each of their compositions. And then there's a total around just around 250 there's a few more that are attributed to him which are not in Sangeeta Sampradaya Pradarshini. And then with Shyama Sastri, the number of Kirtanams are much less. So we're talking, I think there's probably about 60 or so, and even then, only a few, and not as prolific. So there itself is sort of giving you an understanding of the fact that Tyagaraja does, even within the Trinity, he obviously dwarfs the other two in terms of the number of compositions. And of course, we know that Tyagaraja Swami composed on other deities. We know that he did compose on Devi, he did compose on Vinayagar, he even composed on Kartikeya. Shivan, of course, he composed on as well. But the large focus, the focus of his compositions were that of Rama. So I think then if you look at why things are the way they are, then that's one aspect of it. Mm-hmm. I think also another thing that should be noted as well is that as the Sabha system evolved, and I think over the last century and a bit, it's certainly become a lot more prominent and prolific as discussed before. So during that evolution time, the practitioners of art around when this system really took off, which was the early 1900s, what you'll find is that a lot of them, probably by coincidence or not, but a lot of them fell under the Tyagaraja Parampara as well, which I think is important. So, you've got prominent composers who came after Tyagaraja Swami, like Pattanam Subramanian Iyer, and then, of course, through him, you've got Pochi Srinivasa Iyengar, Mysore Vasudevachar, and even like in the contemporary composers like Dr. M. Balamurali Krishna, Padma Bhushan Lalgudi G. Jayaraman sir. See, all of these, they all fall within a different branch of the Tyagaraja musical lineage, and also a lot of the famed practitioners like Ariyakudi Ramanuja Iyengar, Shammangudi Srinivasa Iyer. And also not only that, but they were also tunesmiths as well. They tuned a lot of kirtanams, like particularly Shammangudi. I mean, he's said to have done almost 300 of Swati Tirunal's compositions alone. So again, that influence of not just the fact that Tyagaraja Swami sort of is more prolific of the Trinity, and then in addition to that, a lot of the people that came after him, even the composers, they were from his lineage, so that they also did compose on Rama, like Patnam Subramanian composed quite a bit as well, and then on top of that, we also have a lot of the practitioners falling within this tree. So naturally, I think it's a fair assumption to say that being from such a rich and amazing tradition, that they'll obviously accentuate their strengths, and so we sort of had a lot more of a presentation of the Tyagaraja Swami Kirtanams, which I think it's a natural thing in music, where if you belong to a particular school or if you belong to a particular lineage, then obviously you will focus on those things from your school. Also, I think in addition to that, and I think one thing about Tyagaraja Swami's Kirtanams is that, he composed such a range of styles of Kirtanams. I mean, I'm not just talking about the fact that the types of Carnatic composition, but even within that, you've got some really heavy Kirtanams, obviously. You've got your Chakani Rajas, you've got your Every Matas, those sort of compositions. And then there are also kind of some like the Utsava Sampradaya Kirtanams. Like there are so many different varieties of Kritis, yes, sorry. You've got so many different varieties of compositions of Saint Tyagaraja, which then, when you've got such a variety, obviously, then you can fit them into different parts of the kacheri as well, which I think is important because then, whereas like you wouldn't necessarily see a Dikshadar Kirtanam coming in the second half or the near end of a kacheri, whereas it's still, very common to see Saint Tyagaraja's compositions even around there. So now you've got that additional representation within a kacheri structure of Tyagaraja Swami's Kirtanam.
Of course, not that it's interesting. I think there's a huge unpacking of the kacheri format, structure, and all that especially in the last few years. I think. I mean, is it Ramanujayangar is the one credited, I believe, with the
and Palagad Maniayan. Both. A lot of people think it's just Ariyakudi, but it was actually Palagad Maniayan also had a say in that, because also that structure also includes a variety of different thalams as well. There are rules around that you don't do two rupakams in a row. You don't do two Mr. Chapas in a row. Things like that. So a lot of that also, yes, but the two of them anyway.
I mean, obviously there are an ocean of compositions, as you've already alluded to, within Tyagaraja's work. It's interesting. I mean, are there particular kritis or that you through which you have almost understood the notion or the concept or the idea of Rama better, or are there things that stand in your mind amongst those compositions?
Yeah, I think even if you look at like the different composers and how they kind of experienced Rama, and I would say I would make this one point about Tyagaraja versus even some of the other composers is that Tyagaraja, his interaction with Rama was like a very personal relationship. We know that in his kirtanams, obviously there were those ones where he saw him as a god and just he venerated him and just you are everything, you are the almighty Jagadananda Karaka, you are the lord of the universe. He would sort of give like that sort of he'll paint Rama in that picture. And then at the same time, you can also kind of start to see that for him, it was like he and Rama were like, they had a very personal relationship. So for him, there are times when he laments the fact that Rama does not come to him sooner, where, particularly like Adamodi Galade is, I think, a lovely example where he's like, why do you not talk to me? It's like, he talks to him like a friend. It's like how we would sort of interact amongst ourselves where, it's like if someone does a message for a couple of weeks or it's like, have you forgotten me? It's like, you are the Lord that even when Anjaneya, he's an avatar of Shiva. Even when he comes to see you, you did not talk to him. You did not talk to him directly. You talked through, Lakshmana. So it's like, why would you think of this poor Tyagaraja? And then there are times where, then he looks at Rama's and Sita's like his parents, Sita Mayamma. It's a classic example, and that comes in on so many different levels. And then another one would be that, in terms of like, he even treated him as a child, Yala Loka Vaiba. Where he's like, he's rocking him to sleep because he sees him as a baby and he's singing a lullaby. Or there are times when he sort of highlights Rama in the context of Koluva Yunade, where he's like, you are the king, you are the ruler, and so I think there was So in him, with Tyagaraja Swami, I think you get this lovely or end-to-end picture. And I think the fact that you touched on, of course, the fact that Valmiki Ramayanam was obviously the first and most prominent version, and we know that he was influenced hugely by the Valmiki Ramayanam, and therefore, as per the Ramayana, which sort of takes us through the birth of Rama from Balakandam right through to the Ayodhya Kandam, which, then talks about the battle, the conquest. So he covers that range of Rama. I find like with say Dikshitar, whereas it was more like Dikshitar's was like a poetic description, or it was more like it's more like I think if you look at Dikshitar, he was more of a scholar who in my view he kind of approached Rama in a more scholarly way, and it was just more like it was a little bit more he was it wasn't so much just like the veneration, or sometimes it wasn't the adulation, or it was see with Tyagaraja Swami, I think it was like there was more immersion in the way that he portrayed that character, whereas with
Can I,
yeah.
given that we've had such a discussion on Tyagaraja, I mean, specific kritis that come to mind for you that you would, love to unpack? I mean, certain kritis that I think of Tyagaraja is like, I mean, there's so many to talk about. Even you could talk about the
Mm,
Jagadananda Karaka and all of the epithets of Rama,
mm,
the way in which that's modeled on the Vishnu Sahasranamam. It's
mm,
just, it's amazing, like even kritis like Brova Bharama, which I think, these lively
mm,
popular kritis, which I think in many ways are given a lot of Sangita Bhavam, and there's so many Sangatis that have been embedded into the renditions of those
mm,
compositions. Um, you know,
mm,
many of these, there's the language, as you say, is less perhaps scholarly in the way, in the style that Dikshitar adopted. A lot of it is
mm.
on bhakti rasa, or in, as you said, a conversation. What are some of the kritis that I mean, you've talked about Ardamodi Galade. What are some of the other kritis that I suppose stand out for you? One of the ones I quite like, Brova Bharama. I mean, I think just, Bahudari, I think is a beautiful ragam. But for me, just it almost is like this archetype example of the classic Tyagaraja Kriti on Rama. Is describing and extolling him with all the glory in which I think demonstrates Lord Rama worship amongst Hindu devotees today. And it's very interesting because Rama worship, even to some extent, almost more than Hindu worship, has spread across many, many groups outside of, obviously, countries like India, where Hinduism is very dominant, because the Ramayanam itself is a story, a tale, an epic that many communities can relate to. So you'll note that in areas like Bali and Java, there are retellings of the
Mm,
Ramayana in their own languages, with their own local specific traditions that have been woven in to that rendition. So
mm,
I just find it very interesting when you take kritis like Tyagaraja kritis, almost because there is a universality of it in that it extols Rama. So if you take Brova Bharama, Brova
mm,
Bharama, Raghurama, the Bhuvana Mella Nivei Nannu Okanni, like it's
mm,
just this, you are Lord Raghurama, one who comes from that dynasty, the Raghu dynasty, and you are protector of the entire universe. I just feel these are the kinds of um, uh, lyrics that are almost simple in their devotional quality, and therefore when you have the Sangita Bhavam that you as a performer can embed into those lyrics, because of course Carnatic music is not always performed as in vocal. So
mm.
instrumentally, it's performed as well. But the Sangita Bhavam that comes with that allows for that really beautiful coming together of um, Sahityam, meaning,
Mm. Yeah.
and musicality that I think is very evident in Tyagaraja, which is probably one of the reasons why all of these kritis have such popular appeal in the way that
Yeah.
Carnatic music is performed today. But that's why I was curious
Yeah.
as to your thoughts on any Tyagaraja kritis that that's come to mind for you on Rama, specific ones.
Yeah. So if you were to sort of go down and look at a couple of different ones, I would say specifically, I think what I like about is that he composed on specific instances in the Ramayana, which I think if you didn't sort of focus on those different elements anyway, just giving a snapshot of who Rama is in a composition, which tends to be the more of the scholarly type of approach, then you may miss it. Like, so for instance, Manasaloni, the way that there he's not just talking about, okay, hey Rama, you're the hero and my focus is on you, but here it's more like, okay, what was in Sita's heart, what was she thinking when she first saw you in Mithila, or it's like in Mukari, the composition, Entanine,
Mm.
composed from the perspective of Shabri. And I think like these sorts of, I think that adds to Tyagaraja Swami's composition work, is that it wasn't just the focus on Rama, that he also brought in a lot of the characters. Lakshmana plays a very big role in a lot of the Tyagaraja Swami's compositions as well, where, Paluku Paluku Lakutene, where he's talking about, the sweet words of Lakshmana, and the way that he just brings in all these different characters as well. And I think that is something that I found really special with the way that Tyagaraja Swami has handled bringing Rama to life in these Carnatic compositions. And of course, like there is the stream of kirtanams, like there's just so many just on extolling Rama as Rama's virtues and everything great about him, or Ramabana, or just like, these are like, it will just talk about specific topics or like specific things that sort of relate to Rama.
That's really interesting. I almost feel like my understanding of Tyagaraja Kritis is almost somewhat different. I see Tyagaraja as his, because he has so many different compositions. In each of them, he can take a different angle, but in all of those, there's an element to which he is extolling the Lord in a very broad sense. But within that, as I think you said earlier, you almost get like this nugget of gold of some little episode or some little reference to a very specific part of the Valmiki Ramayana that I find really interesting. And by comparison, I look at a composer I do want to come to in this conversation is Arunachala Kavi, who took a very different approach. He's pre-Tyagaraja, pre-Trinity. Arunachala Kavi did almost the opposite, where he did a magnus opus, the Ramanatakam, by going through the entire Ramayana as one story, but in song form or poem form, which was ultimately tuned, which we'll come to. What just because we're still focused on conversations about the Trinity, you touched on earlier about like Dikshita having a more scholarly approach to Rama. It was interesting because I think of one of the kritis like Ramachandraya Namaste in Todi, which is one of the Rama Vibhakti kritis. Here it's interesting. I see what Dikshita has done in that set of kritis is like some of the other Vibhakti kritis. He has used that grammatical form. So there's so many different compositions, Ramachandrena, Ramachandrasya, Sri Ramachandro, using different grammatical forms of that name Rama, Ramachandra. But if you look at this particular kriti, it's one of these very classic Dikshita heavy kritis in Mr. Chapu, in Todi. And it's interesting because similar to, it almost, for me, carries a slightly more similar style to some of the Tyagaraja Kritis that I see, where he is looking at different ways of describing the glory of the Lord. Whereas I take some of the other Kritis of Dikshita, for me, they feel like, for example, you'll take like a Bala Gopala, and you can see that he is unpacking the entirety of that Raja Gopala Swami deity in Mannagudi, and features of the temple and all that. Whereas it's interesting for me, at least if I take a kriti like that, the focus seems to be on the similar bhakti rasa that you see in Tyagaraja kritis, which is just really looking at different elements of Rama as a deity. I don't know whether you had any thoughts on that as a comparison point.
Yeah, and I think it's just purely because of like the approach just was taken by two different composers. And I think if you look at Dikshidhar, it's almost like every minute detail of Dikshidhar is just thought out so well. It's just like we've from attending various lecture demonstrations and a lot by Sri Ram Kumar sir, and just like you just realize that there is absolutely nothing in Dikshidhar's compositions that are incidental, whether it's the wording, whether it's even things like the ragas that he chooses, or how he beautifully works in each raga mudra. Like there's so many elements of that, and I think you have to kind of treat Dikshidhar's style of composing in that sort of way, and you just have to kind of go, okay, he sort of went a little bit in his own direction as compared to the vast stream of other composers, and I think whereas and I think that's the thing that I kind of spoke about more earlier as well. And I see Dikshidhar as taking a scholarly approach and a very poetic approach. And that's not to say that there isn't poetry in the compositions of other composers, but it's more like he was a poet at heart, that the way that he thought, and like all his play on words and all of these sorts of things. And I think that's where Dikshidhar was. Whereas if you look at Tyagaraja Swami, I mean, for him, I feel like just based on everything I've read and also looking at the content of his compositions, yes, of course, like you said, there are those style compositions which are very kind of scholarly as well, obviously. But I find that with him, it was just more like what just came from the heart, and it was just like it seems to be an outpouring. Yeah, and I think like there and the other thing is also like there are a lot of compositions of that we now have that are all tied to specific incidents around Tyagaraja Swami's life, and it was just like it was almost like music was a way that he just communicated, even his frustrations, sometimes with Rama, sometimes with the other world, like Nidichala Sukuma. That's a classic example. I mean, again, Tyagaraja Swami could have just said, I'm not gonna come to your court and perform. That's all he had to do. But for him, no, he didn't just do that. He composed because that was how he expressed his emotions. We know, for instance, there's other things like when his brother, of course, threw away his statue, and then again, like we saw Tyagaraja's grief coming out, where he's looking for the Lord, he's unable to find him. So it's like, so I think it was a very experiential type of composer to protagonist relationship that Tyagaraja had, and I think that's what comes out in all of these ones.
I do love this. That even listening to our conversation, and this is why, I mean, these are the kinds of conversations that for me underpin, the whole point of Gamaka, because when we started doing Gamaka many years ago, the idea was we would just have these opportunities to have deep conversations about really specific things within Carnatic music, and even here, the difference of opinions in subtle ways that you and I have, and the ways in which we interpret, really go to shaping, for example, my own understandings of many of these things. we're just a couple of kids in Australia who love Carnatic music, and even just unpacking the differences, subtle differences here between Tyagaraja and Dikshita's styles, some of which have been talked about by people far more, accomplished than you and I. But, just the
100%.
way in which I listen to this outpouring, almost the way in which Tyagaraja composition is almost like the way in which you're talking today for me, which is
Yeah.
this. You're talking about things, and then you will suddenly remember an element of a Tyagaraja Kriti. It's like that's how Tyagaraja composed on Rama. He composed
Mm.
all these things extolling the greatness of Rama, and then suddenly he would remember an element of Rama that he wants to weave into that Kriti. Like I've said earlier about the Shiva mantra, Vishnu mantra,
Mm.
Madhava mantra that he weaves
Yeah.
into that Yavarani. We all love talking about Tyagaraja Dikshita, but I want to perhaps
Mm.
come to another composer we alluded to before, which is Arunachala Kavirayar. We know that
Yeah.
he preceded the Trinity he was around the 1700s, and
Yeah.
he composed the Ramanatakam. Initially, he was one of these young children who had learned very Sanskrit and Tamil to a very high proficiency. He had a very different profession, and ultimately he then settled in Sirkali, where he was encouraged in the pursuit of that, and ultimately became
Mm.
known as Arunachala. He was his name. He became Arunachala Kavi, poet, and composed a few dramas before he was asked by some locals to compose this Ramanatakam, which he,
Mm.
being a poet, I think here is a difference that we can draw already, that he was a lyricist in some ways, but as
Yeah.
a kavi, he composed, and the music was set by two of his pupils, Kotandaraman and Venkataraman.
Yeah.
This is such a huge work, and is largely drawn from the Kamba Ramayanam, which you have a lot of familiarity with. Your thoughts on the contribution of Arunachala Kavi in documenting the story of Rama within Carnatic music?
Yeah, and I think Arunachala Kavi's his works just absolutely beautiful, each one. And what I love about it is obviously that he did sort of shadow a lot of Valmiki's work, but he was also obviously hugely influenced by Kamban as well. And you can see the synergies between those two composers. But what I find was particularly really special before we dive into Ramanatakam, I think it's also, uh, a really another gem of a composition that a lot of people sort of miss, um, which isn't part of the Ramanatakam, is En Palli Kondiraya,
Mm.
which is something that and the very preface of that composition is En Palligondiraya. Palligondada is where the Lord is seen as sleeping on the serpent, and so he's asking En Palligondiraya. And what was really nice is that in the Charanams he covers a couple of the Vishnu avatars, of which Rama avataram is one. And what's really beautiful about this charanam is that, I'll just quickly read some of the words, but, Kaushikan sol kurittadakko, Arakki kulai lambu tharittadakko, Eason villai muditadakko, Parasuramar muram parittadakko. There, that he just effectively covered the major aspects of Balakantam.
Mm.
மாசில்லாத மிதிலேசன் பெண்ணுடன் வழி நடந்த இளைப்போ. So now we finished Ayodhya Kandam, and now we're into Aranya Kandam. தூசில்லாத குகரூடத்திலே துறை கடந்த இளைப்போ. Again, we are in Aranya Kandam. மீசுருமாம் சித்திரகூடத்தை சிகரத்தை களமிசைந்த கிடைப்போ இளைப்போ. And now we're sort of starting to move further into the Ramayana. And then Kashini Mel Marishanodiya Gadi Thorainda Ileipo. So now we're talking about the death of Marisan, and then it sort of like it sort of goes from there and finishes Ravanadigalai Mudita Varutumo, and like it sort of traverses through the in just one
Ramayana.
charanam he covers that, and I think that's really a very special
I
thing
think an
as
interesting
well.
thing to note about that Kriti is, you would well know, is that he had composed the Ramanatakam, and then he came to, he wanted to have the
Yeah,
Arangetram of Ramanatakam at Sri Rangam. So he went to the Sri Rangam temple and composes this because he wants to know whether the Lord will accept Ramanatakam being performed here. And he asks the Lord, at Sri Rangam to wake by singing Yen Palli Kondi Raya, why are you reclining and sleeping in this way? And what is said is that the Lord then gives Arunachala Kaviraya the permission to compose.
yeah. I'm just having some.
I think it's very interesting that you raised the point about the Ian Pallikondi Raya, because as we know, that is Arunachala Kavi had composed the Ramanatakam, and he wanted to have the Arangetram, or the first performance of this, at the Sri Rangam temple, because that is where Kamban is said to have recited the verses of his Kamba Ramayanam probably 600, 700 years earlier, for the first
Yeah.
time at Sri Rangam as well. So he goes to this temple and asks, Lord Vishnu, who is reclining there, why are you sleeping? Why are you reclining? Because he wants the permission to perform. So it is said that he does wake from that slumber and gives Arunachala Kavi the right or the blessing to perform the Ramanatakam there, which is where it is said to have had its Arangetram. And as we know, since then, Ramanatakam, in that time,
Yeah.
toured parts of India. And now, given what we've had with globalization, Ramanatakam has such a prolific role in songs of the Ramanatakam, have such a prolific role in both music, Carnatic music, and Bharatanatyam.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, your thoughts on
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting
the
that you
Ramanatakam?
raised about where the Arangetram took place as well, and that's in the composition itself. The Anapallavi, இரண்டு ஆற்றின் நடுவினிலே, that is where Sri Rangam is, and I think it's just again like the beauty of these compositions, the fact that several hundred years later we're looking at these and we're going, what did he do? Why did he put these in there? And you can just start to see, and you can get into that the headspace of the composer. And like even then, like again, and I think the point that you raised as well was that he wanted to do the Arangetram at Sri Rangam because that's where Kamban had done. If you go to the Sri Rangam temple, you can still see that there's a little place, and it says, and it's opposite the Narasimha Murthy temple, the Narasimha Murthy sanctum as well, because there's a famous anecdote about that Kambaravanam being that that the Lord Narasimha is said to have laughed, but so you can see that in that same place that mandapam is still there for us in history, and it's just lovely that um, Arunachala Kavirayar, he was so influenced by it that he actually wanted to have it done at the same place. And then you're starting to also see that the same way that we get inspiration from these composers, those composers took inspiration from other composers. We know, for instance, Tyagaraja Swami was hugely influenced by Venkata Kavi. So a lot of people wouldn't know this, but also Venkata Kavi also composed on Rama as well. So it's just nice to sort of start to see the mechanics of the composers and how they kind of arrived at some of these sorts of compositions or gems today.
One of the things I have a huge love for the Ramanatakam, partly I, being a Tamil speaker, the poetry of the Ramanatakam is more readily understood than perhaps the Tyagaraja Kritis, which are in Telugu. but that we go from many kritis which are is in a Carnatic context, many of the kritis which are span a whole deity or a whole concept and cover that as a whole, whereas the Ramanatakam takes us in, launches us into a moment in that story, in that great
Yeah.
story. And there are so many different moments. Almost, I mean, I haven't read the Kamba Ramayanam. I don't have the level of familiarity with it that you do. So that's why I'd be interested in some of your thoughts. But there are certain kritis that I just think really add so much color,
Yeah.
drama to the way in which we understand the story of the Ramanatakam. So one of the ones that I just choose, I mean, these are many of the, there are so many kritis in the Ramanatakam, but some of which have more popularity. Perhaps musically they're more appealing to a wider audience. But one of the ones, for example, is Ramanukka Mannan Mudi, which is sung in Hindolam.
Yeah.
An interesting point to note here, as you and I know well, is that his initial pupils, Kotandaramayar and Venkataramayar, had tuned in different ragams, but they have been lost, unfortunately. So they've been retuned, especially in the last century.
Yeah. Yeah.
So taking Ramanukka Mannan Mudi in Hindolam, this is the moment when Manthara comes to Kaiheyi and is questioning her as to why should Raman be the king, because he's the heir apparent to the throne of Ayodhya. Why should it not be Kaiheyi's own son, Bharatan? And so it's interesting because across that composition, at the very start of it, you see Kaiheyi saying to Manthara, how can you ask this? Raman should be the king. But over the course of that composition, you see the language change such that you can see Kaiheyi's tone itself change.
Yeah.
That by the end, she has questioned whether Raman should be. Why should it not be better than? So I just think this is a lovely example of how much we gain so much insight into the Ramayana story through this musical interpretation. But are there any kritis that come to mind for you? Even various kritis.
Yeah, and I think that's a that composition is like you said, it's very beautiful because that's one of the most significant, obviously, turning points in the Ramayana. Because you kind of up to that point in Ayodhya Kandam, you've kind of had the story being set up, and you can kind of see how Ramachandramurti is born on earth to fulfill the prophecy, and you kind of just then you see him sort of growing up, and you just start to see the playful Rama, then you see the warrior Rama, then now he's married, and so this is a very important point because, and I think the other thing that Kaikeyi is of course always portrayed as the villainess. In Kamba Ramayanam, there's a famous line which is "Tiyinum kodiyatiyal." That is she is referred to by Dasaratha eventually as Tiyinum kodiyatiyal, that you are worse than fire. That you are, so she kind of gets this sort of rap, but up until this point though in the Ramayana, it should be noted that Kaikeyi had nothing but love for Rama, and that she had treated him even so to the detriment of Bharatan as her first son, and that she always treated him like that. And it was to be that Manthara used the fact that that there was a fragile truce between Janakan, the father of Sita, and Kaikeyi's own father, because those two kingdoms have traditionally been at war. But obviously, when the alliance was fixed, that they've all of a sudden have to, because now in order to appease Dasratha, obviously they've been at peace, and then so Manthara then obviously changes her mind. And you see that reflected beautifully in this Kirtanam as well, where, Pamarame una Kennedy Peche, where she's saying, how dare you? What do you know? You're just a commoner. How do you know the things of this royal family? How do you understand? He is fit, Nalu Perin Muta Vandi, Avanti, and Kanmani. And you can just see the way that she talks about him. And I think that in that immersion, the way that, like you said, we're not just seeing a snapshot, but we're seeing like a drill down into this particular episode, and it gives you this lovely little, snapshot of what happened in this key moment. Another one is like, of course, Ramanai Taruvai in Sindhu Bhairavi, which is when Vishwamitra comes and he requests Dasarathan. And once again, like, it's very interesting. I mean, I know that this was subsequently tuned, but it was tuned in Sindhu Bhairavi, which I think is a very interesting raga, because the very character of Vishwamitra is one that you see he has this kind of rap as being a bit of a person with a short temper and a very powerful sage, but that sage goes and he requests something from Dasaratha, and he's requesting that he gives his son. And of course we know that he was trying to fulfill the greater prophecy and all of that. But like it's interesting the way that that Sindhu Bhairavi was the raga that was selected, because you kind of see that this is behavior that is in direct contrast to the overall character of Vishwamitra. And I think, and of course, Yaro is probably that's just probably one of the most, for want of a better word, that's one of the most highly romanticized aspects of the works of Kavirayar, and I think it's one of the most special points, because in Kamba Ramayanam, I think there are certain things which certain lines which became very, very famous, and of course, thus comes Avalum Nokinal, Annanum Nokinal, which is of course the equivalent line in the Kamba Ramayanam, whereby they both meet for the very first time.
Yeah.
Right. So, therefore, the equivalent in the Rama Natakam is this Yaro Ivar Yaro composition, which I think is just extremely beautiful. And what was also a couple of interesting things about this Kirtanam is twofold. One is that we now sing it in Bhairavi, but traditionally Yaro was actually in Saveri. And it was to be that it was retuned in Bhairavi. And I think that then brings like a little bit of a different problem with that, which is that, we don't have the original tuning or the original intention of Arunachala Kavirayar, which then means our ability to interpret his thought process becomes less powerful. So that's one thing. But the other thing about this composition as well is that there was a bit of a scholarly debate as to whose perspective it was written from as well. Whether it was going to be, whether it was Rama, because he's saying, and some scholars would say, why would he say Ivar? Why would he address Ivar? Because at that point he was still a king and she was still a young girl. So it's like, so there's a couple of different perspectives, but I think the generally accepted thought process we have this Kirtanam is that it was actually composed from the perspective of Rama.
Yeah.
And also it's sort of some people kind of justify the way that Sita's character is portrayed in Kamba Ramayanam is such that, Sita would not be singing Yaro Ivar Yaro if she would see a man walk through, Mithila. That's one of the other reasons. And also there's a nice little line, Vandu Sevais Tarugurar at the end as well, which would, they would say that, well, inconsistent with the rest of Ramayana, which is not that Rama did survey for Sita, but rather that it was Sita who did survey
You
for
touch on a
Rama.
really interesting point for me, which is one thing I really love about the Ramanatakam is that there's this really detailed characterization because the story it is a story, and we see episodes of it. For example, in a Carnatic context, they'll select a Ramanatakam Kriti to feature at one part of the concert or many parts. But we are being communicated things from the perspective of whether it's Rama, but also Lakshmana, Sita, and whatnot. Whereas a lot of the kritis in other on Rama are often from the perspective of like a devotee of Rama,
Yeah.
Lord Rama. So then I think when you go to that element of characterization, there's a drama and nuance that you see because an element of the religious devotion is taken out of the portrayal of these characters, and they become characters as part of a wider tale. So one of the critics that you and I both love, Yeppadi Manam Tulindado, in Husseini, which Sita singing, "How could you have thought to not take me into the forest?" when Rama suggests that she be left behind, and this is apart from, I think, apart from it being an interesting critique told to us from the perspective of Sita, what it also is it shows us that Sita was given some strength here, which is something that is that influence of the Kamba Ramayanam in how Sita is portrayed, but you could probably speak better to this than I can.
Yeah, and I think like in this instance, we see this that's just a very special composition as well because here we are sort of starting to see the strength of Sita. And I think one of the things that Tyagaraja Swami also highlighted as well was also in the Kamboja Kirtanam, which just doesn't, the name escapes me for the time being. But again, Sita as a goddess, and like she is not just a helpless damsel as as some people might have may just sort of think of her to be, but actually here she is actually going to her husband and saying, "Padi manam turindado, how could you make, you've made the promise that no matter what, we were going to be together, and now how can you say that all of a sudden now you're going to just leave me and going?" And then so you're seeing that strength of character where she's not just saying, she's not being forced into going to the forest. She's not being, she's not being ordered to do it. In fact, she's given the choice to actually stay to stay back, but she chooses that. And I think that ability to choose, and I think that there you can see the emotion behind her, and you're also starting to see that of course we venerate them as God, and but whereas there was a relationship between the two, and that the love that Rama and Sita had for each other is really kind of is starting to see now. And also the selection of Husseini as a raga is just a masterstroke for obvious reasons, and it sort of evokes those emotions. And I think I really like the fact that as you mentioned that there is a characterization. You kind of start to see some of the other characters also starting to come through as well. Like Hanuman, of course, plays a significant part, obviously from the Kishkinda, and of course Sundarakandam. He is the hero of Sundarakandam, really. So you can start to see him playing a significant role as well. Kanden Sidaye, Kanden Raghava, very famous composition. And then there you're starting to see Rama as well, like Vittu Vidada Sidaye, Ade Ravana. So there you are starting to see Hanuman's characterization sort of coming out nicely, where he's going up and he's going, hey, he wasn't just the servant of the Lord, he was a fierce warrior. And we know that when it comes to you know what happened in the Ramayana, he plays a significant role in the war, and here he stands up. He stands up to Ravana. So you starting to see all these different elements, and I think the way that they've and I think what's really special about it is about Rama Natakam was that it wasn't specifically just on Rama, but it was on that
Yeah.
entire work, which is the Ramayana. So therefore, you start to see all these elements, which I believe add to the allure and beauty of who Rama was. You know.
I think, if I may, I mean, obviously, you and I have and can spend hours and hours talking about topics that of interest to us. I think it's a really nice point to end on, because at the start we started talking about Rama and Carnatic music, and that's the point. But
Mm.
as we move into a conversation that involves Arunachala Kavi, it almost becomes a conversation about Ramayana and Carnatic music,
Mm.
and he
Yeah.
dominates. This composer dominates that conversation. Um, Subangan,
Mm.
thank you very much for your time. I'm going to,
Yeah.
as I said earlier, the whole point that Gamaka has these kinds of conversations. Yes, we put on Carnatic music concerts, but it's because of this. It's this kind of passion that we all have of Carnatic music, that it's not just about performing, but it's also about unpacking Carnatic music in the way that we have. So
Mm.
this conversation reinvigorates my day in thinking about, this is why I have so much passion for Carnatic music, and especially speaking to someone like yourself who has so much passion for it as well. Um, Thank you once again. I do appreciate you taking the time for doing this for Gamaka, and look forward to another conversation on more topics in the future.
Very much so. Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Cheers.